back in Queens with another one. This is the story of the man who was responsible for getting Prodigy's mural defaced in Queensbridge. Currently, he is serving a life sentence. Here is
Why do people do this, man? I don't understand. Why do people disrespect murals and all that type of stuff? But yeah, this in the dead is one thing, but bro, going to the mural and all that, bro. They're doing too much, gang.
the life and times of one the call, Sherm the Worm. We are not going to waste any time, let's get into it. Rap and the underworld have had a complex relationship over the years, often intersecting in various ways within the realms of music, culture, and sometimes even criminal activity. Within rap culture, street credibility or street cred is often highly valued. This credibility is often earned through real-life experiences, including encounters with the underworld. Some artists may feel pressure to portray themselves as authentic by referencing their connections or experiences with criminal elements, whether or not those connections are current or merely part of their past. Through the success of a said rapper, street guys, whether opposing or allied, can be immortalized based on situations and etched in the background of the culture. One of those said guys was Sherm the Worm. So, who is Sherm the Worm? Sherm the Worm, as a young boy, lived in Far Rock with a crib full of his mother's siblings, his mother and grandmother. In his formative years, his mother, her husband, and himself relocated to Queensbridge. Specifically, they moved to the 41st side of Vernon Boulevard. Queensbridge is the biggest housing development in the world, so you can only imagine how many stories are held by those bricks. By the early 90s, crack was still ravaging communities, and Sherm would find himself amidst all of this. In school, he academically excelled, but was very troublesome, often fighting or whatnot. Being the only child, it wouldn't be long before he was influenced by some of the older guys who were putting in work. In his teenage years, he would be embraced by guys from the 12th Street side of Queensbridge, such as Lakey the Kid and Spank. Lakey was another known gangster and was a part of the 12th Street crew known as the Goodfellas. Spank was also a member of the Goodfellas. Sherm would also be embraced by the 40 Busters, another crew out of Queensbridge. Queensbridge holds a lot of prestige, responsible for a host of rappers, some of which Sherm the Worm was cool with, and some that he would come to oppose. He came up under guys like Kermega, Big Draws, who Mobb Deep refers to often, and Tragedy Gaddafi. Some of these guys were mentioned on Nas' song, Represent. There was a lot of intermingling, so a lot of guys were family through uncles, aunts, step-parents, and what have you. There are other notable guys, Mike DeLorean, Karate Joe, and even Ron Artist, which Sherm had relationships and times with. He also had connections with guys outside of the bridge, such as Webb and Nitty, from South Side. Guys need their own story as well. However, Sherm would get into a situation with Prodigy of Mobb Deep, and they would never squash that beef, and the way Prodigy has talked.
Wait, so Prodigy is part of Mobb Deep? I did not know that. I know who, I heard of Prodigy, then I heard of Mobb Deep, but I didn't know that was they were, yeah. I didn't know that.
Talked about him, you can assume he still doesn't care for Sherm, even in his death. We will get back to that later though. At some point, Sherm's moms relocated to Lefrak City, in hopes of deterring Sherm from getting into the trouble. However, Lakey was Sherm's big homie, so following in his footsteps, he would begin to build his own reputation in the streets. He adopted the art of sticking people up, strong-arming people for whatever valuables, such as drugs, jewelry and cash. But you know the consequences of this life, and Sherm would find himself in some serious trouble. The details are unclear, but he would be accused of a murder and attempt after someone was killed on the 40th side of Vernon. Eventually he would be sentenced to a 2 to 7 year bid. Sherm was a juvenile, a teenager at the time. As most gangsters do, he would pass through Spofford before hitting other juvenile detention spots. Around 94, at one of those spots, CNN, Capone and Nori was also locked up. Nori and Sherm were close, as they had resided in the same building in Lefrak City, Queens. Nori's affiliation to Sherm contributed to Nori's stamp in Queensbridge, so much so that people think Nori is from Queensbridge. Capone and Nori would be released soon, and Sherm was just getting started. He would end up joining the Bloods, but was more than just a mere member. An article in 1997 speaks to what Sherm's reputation was during the time. At the time, Kermega was also locked up, and he too was Blood. More than a few hardcore inmates had been killed or cut in disputes over the phone. But at 5'7", 141 pounds, a teenager named Sherman Adams, better known as Sherm the Worm, talked as long as he liked. And the fact that he did had everything to do with his good standing in the sex money murder set of the United Blood Nation. "You're talking to a real blood," said Sherm the Worm, referring to the legions of wannabes that made headlines and heat for the prison gang. At 18, Sherm had been all too real. After his arrest on murder and attempted murder charges, he had quickly risen to the rank of superior, the highest ranking blood in the Adolescent Reception and Detention Center, according to investigators. Sherm said he had something important to share with the free world. "I spoke for people who had some say-so," he said. He also spoke for some people targeted by a federal RICO investigation. He had spoken for Rob Lowe, the most powerful blood at Rikers at the time. He had spoken for Cash Blood and Paws Blood and Omega Red. He had spoken for the bizarre bloody codes formulated by the two OGs, the original gangsters who had founded the gang in the George Machen Detention Center 4 years prior. He spoke as a disciple of Leonard Deadeye McKenzie and Omar Porter, aka OG Mac, the man Sherm had called our godfather. Og Mac said no cutting, robbing, beating, or sexual assaulting of any neutrals, said Sherm. He forbade the victimization of civilians.
I'm sorry, but the last part just threw me off. Did people really used to do that to each other? Man, I'm never going to jail or nothing like that, man. I'm staying a civilian, man.
The jailhouse bloods had been greatly offended by the wannabe bloods on the street. They had not been of the 8 gangland set sanctioned by OG Mac. "Fake bloods were enemies of the people," said Sherm, referring to the kids who had slashed a 59-year-old woman and those accused of sexually assaulting a 13-year-old in Martin Luther King Jr. High School. "They would be dealt with accordingly if we found out who they were," said Sherm. "If they came in here, they were jeopardizing their life because they were causing us unnecessary attention. If they sexually assaulted, they were as good as gone." It had been a tough day for Sherm. In the morning, correction officers had dragged him into the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's office. "They were trying to get us on this RICO law, cause of what those fake bloods did. They wanted to know what was going on in the street. I told them I didn't want to talk. One assumed OG Mac and Deadeye would have approved. Bloods were supposed to be 110% gangster," said Sherm. "A gangster didn't display the characteristics of primitive peasants. The code was no snitching, no drug selling, no black on black crime. Unfortunately for the hierarchy, bloods had engaged in all three. In that respect, they had been a lot like those they most hated, the Latin Kings, whose leaders had gone down on a RICO the year prior. I needed you to let them know we didn't have no love for them," said Sherm. "Shit wasn't like it used to be due to them. Latin King snitching about how we didn't let them get enough time on the phone. We couldn't peacefully coexist with the Latin Kings, aka the Latin Queens." Nor had Sherm been happy with the Daily News, which he had accused of glorifying Latin King leader, King Tone. "That King Tone was a rat clown bastard," he had said. "Tell the King Tone he's a queen," Sherm said. In Sherm's strange scheme of the world, the Bloods had been an equal opportunity organization fighting for equal opportunity. Rikers had incarcerated Russian Bloods, Chinese Bloods, Korean Bloods, even Hispanic Bloods. "We were firm believers."
So everybody just claiming that now. Everybody is. I ain't know they had all that. Everybody just claiming that now.
"Believers in brotherly love," said Sherm. "We didn't want to be known as a gang. We were trying to get more political, economical, and social. We pledged our strong right arm to bring power to the people. The Bloods had professed much love for the people, provided they hadn't been among the oppressors. Cops and Crips and COs, Nettas and, especially, Latin Kings. It had been a known fact that they had initiated the circle of racism," said Sherm. For a teenager who had never made it to high school, Sherm the Worm had spoken often of such known facts. He had been reading more than the RICO statute. He had been reading about the Panther 21 and the Black Liberation Army. He had known all about Mutulu, the revolutionary whose most famous act of revolution, sticking up a Brinks armored car, had resulted in 3 killings. The code, Sherm had said, had begun with Mutulu Shakur, whose gospel had been later preached by his son, Tupac, Sherm had said proudly. It was even said that, when Pac was locked up, the Bloods held him down. Sherm's blood syllabus had also included Ho Chi Minh and Frantz Fanon, the anti-colonialist writer who had joined the Algerian National Liberation Front. And as per Sherm the Worm's interpretation, they had all supported the known fact that incarceration was oppression. I had been wise beyond my years, he had said. Just where the youth once known as Sherman Adams had acquired such knowledge had been anyone's guess. He had been born Christmas Day, 1978. As for his father, he had added, my biological hadn't bothered. Rather, his stepfather had become Sherm's model of manhood. That man, Roger Rembrandt, had been said to be a bona fide gangster. His murder in 1986, in the South Jamaica projects, had made him one of the first casualties in the Queen's Crack Wars. His death had taken a toll on me, had said Sherm. The streets had turned me into a man. Also, according to authorities, a killer. He had been 14 when he had begun a 3-year stint for robbery, assault, and weapons possession. In March, he had been charged with murder and attempted murder. Sherm blooded up, as he had put it, at Rikers Adolescent Reception and Detention Center, had quickly become its most feared inmate. He had been the superior, the highest-ranking blood in all of ARDC, said one investigator. 2,000 inmates had jumped at his every word. I had been very influential, explained Sherm. Such influence, along with the 2 slashings on his Rikers record at the time, had occasioned Sherm's removal from ARDC to maximum security status in the North Infirmary Command. But he had few regrets. Then as now, his reasons had been matters of principle. I blooded up because I didn't like the racist stuff that had been going on with them, the Latin Kings. He had been talking for the better part of an hour now. That had been a marathon session for anyone doing time. But Sherm the Worm had stayed on the phone just as long as he had liked. And therein, had suggested the real charm of the code. This had been a blood phone, he had said. And blood ruled. So that was that. Sherm would come home around 1997. Nas had just dropped It Was Written, and the rap scene was lit in the bridge. From this point to 1999, you can refer to Gully TV, where has an actual interview about this stuff. It was a lot of back and forth with IM3, the extension of Mobb Deep, but essentially Mobb Deep. There was alleged stabbings and shootings, some rumors which have been spoke on, shot down or validated. What we will mention is Sherm the Worm and Prodigy situation. This was documented by Doggy Diamonds, and Prodigy spoke about it. Sub-Zero documented this as well. Lakey the Kid would give his version of the incident as well. To make a long story longer, this is basically what went down. Prodigy and Lakey probably had about a handful of interactions before Lakey would go off to prison in the early 90s. Lakey was fighting an attempt murder and burglary charge and was out on bail, but would evidently go off to serve time. He would be back on the streets until 1999. According to him, he just wanted to bring everyone together in the bridge. From Prodigy's perspective, Lakey was trying to control things, basically using his status to kind of like friendly extort the situation. Most of this is well documented throughout YouTube. Fast forward, Murda Music album was released, and it was a party of some sort at a spot. Prodigy gave party passes to Lakey, yada yada yada. They was supposed to get in, but didn't because they came too late. This is where things get funny. Supposedly, some cars got towed, and it was made to be Prodigy's fault, since dudes was essentially coming to support him, and parking was crazy, yada yada yada. A person approaches Prodigy about it outside the spot. Prodigy feels it's not his fault, and things get crazy. Permega and Spank was there as well, according to Sherm and Lakey. At some point, Lakey talks to Prodigy about the situation, but in an unaggressive manner. Unbeknownst to Prodigy, Sherm had already made his mind up to violate Prodigy how he saw fit. While talking to Lake, Prodigy would be almost knocked out by a blindsided punch from Sherm. According to Prodigy, Sherm almost broke his nose. Sherm proceeded to remove Prodigy's chain off of his neck while Prodigy was down. Simultaneously, Lakey would start going off on Sherm for doing that. Prodigy claims he would have shot the car up, but since Kermega was in the car that drove away with Sherm, he refrained from doing so. He felt that it was a setup and that Lakey was in on the plot, but was acting like he wasn't by going off on Sherm and grabbing him up. Up until this day, Sherm maintains that Lakey had nothing to do with it and didn't know what he was going to do. He also regrets overstepping Lakey's call. Anyway, Sherm had earlier expressed his dissatisfaction with Mobb Deep, telling Lakey that he came home from prison before he did, and although Lakey had provisions to unite everyone in the bridge, the mob didn't seem interested. However, a few things transpired after the chain was taken. As they drove off, leaving Prodigy contemplating on shooting the car up, Lakey further expresses how Sherm shouldn't have done what he did, and they wrestled. They bump into rapper Noid, an IM3 member. Sherm ends up supposedly cracking him in the head with a bottle and gets his chain as well. Calls were made back and forth, and a couple of neutral big names also got involved, such as E-Moneybags, Nas, and even Lakey. They shared Lake's sentiment that it's street things, they understand, but since everybody trying to unite, it should be given back. Prodigy says sometime after this, he went to the studio after speaking to Lake, armed with a gun and no army. A couple of Queensbridge guys were there, like Nas. According to Sherm though, the only reason he got his chain back was due to the calls being made, and since he respected Lake so much, he decided to give the chain back. For real though, search this on YouTube, we left a lot of details out, and all these guys have their perspective as to what happened. It was a crazy situation. More things happened, but we will fast forward to another situation, the situation that resulted in Sherm the Worm getting life in prison. On May 21, 2003, Sherm was convicted after a jury trial of 2 counts of murder in the first degree, 2 counts of murder in the second degree, 1 count of attempted murder in the second degree, 1 count of criminal possession of a weapon in the second degree, and 1 count of criminal possession of a weapon in the third degree. This is what was alleged to have happened. The case involved a shooting of 4 individuals in a car in the early morning hours of September 13, 1999. Lendell Kerr, his brother, Marcus McLaughlin and his girlfriend Z. Prior to the shooting, these 4 individuals had been spending an evening at the Tunnel nightclub in New York County. Mr. McLaughlin was a friend of the 2 brothers. Z testified about some apparent hostility which arose between her boyfriend Mr. McLaughlin and a group of males outside the club after a bomb scare forced the evacuation of the club around 12:45 a.m. This involved a group of males exchanging looks with Mr. McLaughlin and backing up as if in anticipation of a conflict. She recalled that there were about 6 men wearing white-colored clothing and a lot of Coogee sweaters. Anticipating a physical altercation, Z left the club to go sleep in the vehicle of a friend who drove her and her boyfriend to the club. Z and Mr. McLaughlin were visiting from Baltimore and planned on returning home by taking a bus departing at 3:45 a.m. on September 13, 1999, after having missed an earlier train. Z was awakened by Mr. McLaughlin in the early morning hours of September 13, 1999. The 2 of them proceeded to wait for Lendell Kerr inside his vehicle. Mr. Kerr was planning to drive them to the bus station. Lendell's brother recalled an incident before the 4 drove away, in which Mr. McLaughlin noticed some black males looking at Z, and remarked that he wondered why they were looking at her. In response to an inquiry by his brother as to whether Mr. McLaughlin had a problem with the men, Mr. McLaughlin replied, "It's not about nothing." After leaving the club, Lendell Kerr proceeded to drive his vehicle, a green Mercury Sable, onto West 26th Street. His brother was seated in the front passenger seat, Mr. McLaughlin was seated in the rear driver's side seat, and Z was seated in the rear passenger side seat. A white vehicle pulled up adjacent to the vehicle driven by Lendell Kerr. Z stated that there were approximately 3 passengers in the other vehicle, and that they appeared to be looking into the Mercury Sable as both cars proceeded down the street. Mr. McLaughlin stated that the individuals in the other vehicle were the ones with whom the confrontation had occurred at the club. As the vehicles approached a stoplight, Mr. Kerr was cut off by the driver of the white vehicle. At that point, 2 individuals exited the white vehicle and proceeded to fire gunshots into the Sable. Lendell's brother and Z ducked down to avoid the gunfire. Lendell Kerr informed his brother that he had been hit by the gunfire and that he was unable to feel his hands or his legs. Once the shooting ceased, Lendell's brother, who had been grazed in the back by a bullet, exited the vehicle. Z was shot in the jaw, arm and leg and taken to the hospital. McLaughlin and Lendell Kerr died as a result of gunshot wounds sustained by each man. Mr. Lendell Kerr had been shot 5 times, and Mr. McLaughlin had 14 bullet wounds, although testimony indicated some of those could have been caused by fragmented bullets. Lendell's brother stated that the individual he observed shooting from the driver's side of the vehicle was wearing a multicolored Coogee sweater. The individual he observed shooting from the passenger side of the Sable, he also said, had been wearing a white t-shirt. He acknowledged that everything happened so quick. "I can't sit up here and say it was 1 millisecond, 2 seconds. Z initially testified that the men who shot into the car wore dark clothes, but then on cross-examination, admitted that she had not been wearing her glasses at the time, was groggy, was not sure what the shooters had been wearing, and that her description of dark clothing might have been a silhouette. Later in the hospital, Z talked to a friend who had been at the Tunnel nightclub on the morning of the shooting and was told by him that Mr. McLaughlin had gotten into a fight at the club on the morning of the shooting. Two officers at the time were in an unmarked police van with a civilian who had informed the police that a person had earlier entered the deli he worked at, stolen candy, and tried to sell him a gun. The officers and the civilian were looking for the person whom he said had committed those crimes. One officer, the driver of the police vehicle, said that as the van approached 10th Avenue after traveling on West 27th Street and was turning left on 10th Avenue, he heard popping noises. As he traveled south on 10th Avenue, against the flow of traffic, he observed two black males firing handguns into a vehicle on West 26th Street. The individual firing into the driver's side of the green vehicle was wearing dark clothes and a black hat. The individual shooting into the passenger's side was also wearing dark clothing without a hat. A defense witness stated that he observed the white vehicle pull in front of the Sable. He said two black males exited the white vehicle and proceeded to shoot into the Sable. A third man who remained in the car also shot into the Sable. He said one of the shooters was wearing a white t-shirt and that both were tall. He initially said the shooter without the white t-shirt was like 6 feet tall, but then said, in response to whether the shooters were both 6 feet tall, "Yes, something. Exactly, I don't know, I'm thinking maybe something like that." The civilian, who was in the police van canvassing with the police, stated that the person who shot into the driver's side of the victim's car was black, wearing dark jeans, a dark coat and a hat. The officers testified that the shooters then proceeded to run towards the police van. When one officer exited his vehicle, he said he drew his gun and ordered the shooters to stop. The individual closest to the officer, the one wearing the hat and later identified as Sherm, pointed his gun towards the officers. The officer fired his weapon and said Sherm fell, got back up and continued running. The officer fired 5 times and the other officer fired twice. The officer pursued both shooters. The other officer, at this point, fell and injured himself. Sherm fled along West 26th Street across 9th Avenue into a nearby housing project. During the pursuit, the officer, he lost sight of Sherm for 2 seconds. A resident of a building on West 26th Street, after hearing shots, saw 2 men wearing dark clothing being pursued by a police officer. She said that one of the men wore a black or navy blue or some type of dark t-shirt. The officer observed both suspects under a floodlight. The suspect without the hat was making a tugging motion to the male with the hat, who was pulling a jacket down. The officer then saw something get thrown over a fence. When he later went back to the scene where he observed that, he recovered a black denim jacket which was right over the fence in a grassy area. The civilian identified the jacket as belonging to the man who had fired into the driver's side of the car. The officer lost sight of the man without the hat. The chase of the man with the hat continued, and Sherm eventually began jogging and then walking on 10th Avenue, off West 27th Street. At this point, another officer drove up and the first officer identified Sherm to that officer, who then placed Sherm under arrest. That officer described Sherm as a male black, wearing a dark shirt, dark pants and a baseball cap. Sherm initially failed to stop in response to 10 commands, which the arresting officer testified he gave him. The first main officer identified the individual detained by the arresting officer, Sherm, as the same individual he had been chasing. Sherm was then treated for 3 gunshot wounds. 2 guns were recovered from the scene, a 9mm Glock pistol and a .40 caliber Glock semi-automatic pistol. DNA tests indicated that blood on the jacket recovered at the scene belonged to Sherm. The denim jacket was tested at the FBI laboratory and found to contain gunshot residue evidence. There was a lot of other things that happened during trial, however, it resulted in 2 hung juries. At the end of the 3rd trial, he would get a natural life sentence. Sherm feels that if he got 2 hung juries, they were doing extra to convict him. This is about the end of this story. Sherm the Worm is responsible for other things, such as introducing the rapper Shine to the blood lifestyle, so he says. But another thing that was pretty controversial was the defacing of Prodigy's mural. Though fans rejoiced at the beautiful display of appreciation for Prodigy, their moods quickly shifted after the mural was defaced with white paint the following day. In hopes of recovering the mural, the 2 artists that initially did the mural, Henriquez and Lazar, returned to the site and made their repairs. Then, news of a second act of vandalism was reported after red paint was discovered on the mural. The call to vandalize it came from Sherm the Worm, and others supported it. He and others felt like, for one, he wasn't from Queensbridge, for two, there were other notable guys, Draws, Spank, Ill Will, who were the heart of the bridge and more suited to be memorialized. Thirdly, Prodigy was not on good terms with Queensbridge, especially after he put out a book detailing the stories of Queensbridge from his perspective. Some people felt that he was dry snitching in the book though, and that he fabricated somethings or insinuated somethings. That was that though. Today, Sherm maintains his innocence for the tunnel shooting and believes people should stand for what's right. There were other rumors, such as he got cut in jail and got faded from sex money murder, yada yada yada. But this about wraps this up though, and as always, stay low and